I wasn't planning to record another video today. However, I did want to pick up on the news around the Metroid Prime 4 reviews, which have recently dropped. And although I wasn't planning to look at them particularly because I really want to approach this game unspoiled, it's clear from the commentary that many people are concerned by the headline number, which is obviously showing a score of around 80-81, even though there will be considerable back and forth as new reviews are added. Now, this is clearly significantly lower than any previous mainline Metroid Prime games in the series, and especially lower than the Metacritic score for the original GameCube Metroid Prime, which was a mighty 97. Now, personally, my take on reviews is this. When it's a game that I am ambivalent about, I am very interested to read reviews and try to get a sense of whether or not I will enjoy the title. These games are significant investments of money and time, and I want to make sure that I'm going to enjoy the experience at least to the degree that I can. I spent many years before deciding to finally dive into Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and you can bet that I spent a lot of time reading reviews to try to figure out whether this apparently opaque and complex seeming battle system could be for me. However, there were also games where I knew from day one that I was going to be interested, and it would take a spectacularly poor review to push me off course. There is currently nothing in the talk about Metroid Prime should change the decision I made about 8.5 years ago to purchase the game on day one. That's not to say I think the game will be perfect, but realistically, the ultimate matching the original Metroid Prime are always going to be slim, just because that is a true classic title. It's the classic trap of the only way to avoid the difficult second album syndrome is to have a worse first album. However, we are in a situation where there will be a great many people checking out Metroid Prime for the first time and being in a very similar situation to the one I was in 8 years ago with Xenoblade Chronicles 2 of not being quite sure whether or not to dive in. Therefore, I do think the reviews here are particularly important to Nintendo, especially for a franchise which has always been seen as a critical darling, even if it might not be a massive commercial success. And so we need to understand quite closely what these scores mean. Now, before going any further, I realise this could be read as me just defending Metroid Prime for the sake of defending it, but the reality is that I think there is a genuine misreading going on here of the review scores when people are comparing the reviews of Metroid Prime 4 now to the reviews of the original Metroid Prime trilogy from decades previous. What I think is being missed here is that when you look back to reviews in the 2000s or even the 2010s, my contention is that there is probably quite a major difference in methodology. The way these review scores aggregators work is simply to take the numbers attached to different reviews and to find the average. And while that makes sense, if you have scores which are presented in more or less the same format and using more or less the same criteria, it falls down when they are taking reviews that use very different scoring methodologies. To give you an idea of what I mean, let me take you back to the 1990s, where there was a classic British video game magazine called CVG, or Computer and Video Games. They, like many game reviewers at the time, had stuck with a very traditional system of reviewing games, which is the percentage. However, the problem is that as games came out and there was ever more competition to nudge into the higher percentage brackets, the battle between the top percentages grew fiercer and fiercer. I remember in Sega magazine, Sonic 3 getting 96%, and then Dynamite Headdy getting 96%, and then, of course, Sega Rally came along with 97%, and Virtua Fighter 2 came along with 98%. Now, whether anybody was capable of telling a tiny fraction of the difference between these two games, well, that's something for you to decide. But clearly, there was a strong interest from both the readership and the gaming community about extremely tiny differences in game percentages. Now, at a certain point, CVG did a revamp, and they realised that this system really didn't make much sense at all, and so they moved dramatically to a 5-point system. Now, I realise that not everybody likes the 5-point system. I just saw Player Essence mentioning that they prefer 10 points, and I can see the logic of that. But I think they wanted to do a bit of a culture shock and to prove that actually a 5-point system could convey just as much information. They said they would be extremely stingy about giving out 5 points, but they would be giving 4 points to show that a game is still extremely good. In other words, games that might previously have been rated as 94% as opposed to 96% were now to be rated 4 out of 5 as opposed to 5 out of 5. And while this might not seem too significant in the context of a 1990s video game magazine, you have to understand that when this is transposed into modern algorithmically driven review aggregators, what this means is that a game that would have been presented as an 85, 90, perhaps even low to mid 90% game would now be judged as effectively an 80% game, a 4 out of 5 game, and therefore, even though it's one off the top spot in a 4 out of 5 system, it's 20% of the top spot if converted into a percentage. Now, I haven't gone through all of the reviews on the Metroid Prime 4 GameCube site on Metacritic and the Metroid Prime 4 site either, but it does seem to me that just by looking at the types of scores, there are about 34 different scores for the original GameCube Metroid Prime, which do not fall into a neat multiple of 10, i.e. they are 98 and 96s as opposed to 90 or 100. For Metroid Prime 4, at the current time that is only about 22, and most of these are with numbers ending in 5, suggesting that the original review scores were probably out of 20 as opposed to out of 100. My strong suspicion is that these aggregation systems have a strong warping effect on the scores given. In fact, many reviewers in recent times have abandoned scoring entirely, and so the scores recorded on Metacritic may simply be a flattened out reflection of more nuanced views given in the text. Even if we take the example, though, of a title that would have been rated, let's say, 90% under the old system, but is now being rated as 4 out of 5, well, with a number of reviews that Metroid Prime and Metroid Prime 4 currently have, that will be a difference of about a sixth or a seventh of percentage for each review, and that means that over 10 or 20 reviews, you're looking at perhaps a 2% or 4% difference, but all the more if you think that the transition is more pronounced than that, with more reviewers moving towards smaller review score numbers. However, it goes further than that. In a world where percentages are the default, and certainly when I was growing up in the 90s in the UK, video game magazines almost always used percentages to review titles, people became used to judging the differences between small percentages and interpreting what that might mean for the quality of the games. However, when people become used to ratings out of 10 as the default, or even out of 5, that makes it actually much more difficult to use regular percentages because a 95% game can be more readily compared to a 9 out of 10 game, and so the innate flaws of such an inflationary percentage system become apparent. I suspect far fewer people now would go back to very high 90s percentages even if they're using a percentage system, and even though I remember them being very common back in the day. As a consequence, even those minority of people who still use percentages might be a little more circumspect about how they deploy them. Now, that doesn't close the gap between 81% and 97%. The original Metroid Prime is a gold standard game, and Metroid Prime 4 obviously has its quibbles, and frankly, that was always likely to be the case. But I think it does go some way to explain the difference between, let's say, Metroid Prime Hunters, which, let's face it, has never been as beloved as the core titles, and how Metroid Prime Hunters nevertheless seems to be outshining Metroid Prime 4 on pure statistics. It strikes me that if Metroid Prime were new today and still equally as critically acclaimed as it was back then, its Metacritic score might be something closer to 95, whereas if Metroid Prime 4 were somehow transported back 90 years, it might easily have scored in the high 80s or even low 90s, which is pretty consistent with the kinds of scores received by Metroid Prime 2 and 3, which also had plenty of vocal detractors. Now, of course, there are far more reasons than just these for the scores to differ over time. Expectations are far different now, and of course we live in a post-Metroid Prime world where many other games have been influenced by Metroid Prime itself. I also think that many of the people who are reviewing the games are reviewing it in the shadow of its illustrious predecessors. Personally, complaints about hand-holding and challenge, while potentially being frustrating, actually make me feel a little bit good in some ways about the fact that Nintendo are still trying to reach out to a new audience, an audience who don't have the innate understanding of Metroid Prime games that people who have been speedrunning Samus's adventures for decades may have. This game can't not be for those new people as well. It needs to reach out, and in certain respects, while it's understandable that people forget what it was like to be a new player, Nintendo still need to reach that new audience. Now, despite all this, it is clear that Metroid Prime 4 is ranking below other majorly successful games of the recent period, and that is a little sad for me, as I would have loved to see it released to an instant and unambiguous critical acclaim. However, when people are pointing out that it is only a couple of points above Metroid Other M, I have to say I think that 15-year difference plays a massive role in a way that the game is interpreted. Ultimately, I would encourage anybody who is on the fence about the title to check out the far cheaper and unambiguously critically acclaimed entry in the series that is the glorious 2003 title Metroid Prime Remastered. I will return tomorrow with an analysis of the potential sales figures of Metroid Prime 4. Thanks to the channel's Patreon supporters, and please do check out the videos on screen. I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.